Hello. I ended my analysis of Exterminating Angel last time with the scene in which the guests bed down for the night in the Nobile living room with no rational explanation for why they're staying. As they prepare to sleep and dream, the film itself seems to enclose the viewer in a dream as well. It's not just the inherently dreamlike quality of cinema that Baudrillard describes, but it's Buñuel's deliberate invocation of dreams in his style and structure as well. By the repetition of certain words and gestures, the strange introduction of dreamlike symbols, and the dreamlike severing of effects from their causes. Now, you recall that Tarkovsky also described the style of Andrei Rublev as dreamlike, but there we ultimately interpret the film's evolving symbols coherently, and we can piece together the fractured narrative as well. This is not necessarily the case in Buñuel. Exterminating Angel makes this kind of sense-making much more difficult, if not impossible. Now, as the host, the imperturbable Edmundo is concerned about making his guest comfortable. He does everything he can to do so. But throughout their captivity in his home, all he can do really is try to be a calming presence, just as Dr. Conte also tries to function as the voice of civility and restraint. But the fact is that neither of them proves effectual in these attempts to introduce some kind of civility, because they face Francis's hysteria and they face Raoul's belligerent aggression. Edmondo is the ultimate bourgeois conformist. So to make his guests feel less embarrassed, for example, at divesting on that first night, taking off their coats, he takes off his own jacket. He looks beneath the surface of life so little, however, that he assumes that his wife's lipstick has simply faded because of the late hour. He has no thought, no suspicion that she might actually have mussed the lipstick because she's having an affair. Now, the butler, Julio, the only remaining servant, during this sequence that I've described on the first night, sits alone in the dining room. When he enters the salon, he too is going to be trapped there. We see old Russell in a close-up, paralyzed by the heart attack that will kill him. It's a foreshadowing of the mental and physical paralysis that is somehow overtaking and infecting all the guests. In that darkness, Russell looks toward an empty room that the group cannot enter, a boundary marked by human absence. Now, note that Buñuel repeats this long shot of that empty room beyond the salon. But he also repeats the counterpart to that shot. He gives us a repeated long shot looking into the crowded salon from that empty other room through the archway. In short, shooting the scene in that long shot from the room where the guests cannot go, re-emphasizing that invisible demarcation between where they are and where they cannot be. Well, as the guests bed down, Buñuel introduces a third recurring shot. It's an exterior shot of the street in front of the Nobile house. Having been confined claustrophobically to the darkened house with the guests, the viewer welcomes this sunlight and free movement, but these exterior shots are fleeting. You'll note that the camera pans briefly in these shots from Providence Street to the mansion, and then it tilts upward before an editing cut brings us back inside where, after this strange night, everyone has awakened amid general confusion and amazement. Have a look.
¿Qué sucede aquí? No sé cómo hemos podido llegar a esto, pero todo tiene sus límites.
No sé qué decirte. Por el momento habrá que ofrecerles el desayuno. Después de seguro se irán a sus casas.
Por supuesto. Confío en su discreción.
Yo iba enloquecida de un lado a otro. Un vagón de tercera repleto de gente del pueblo se había aplastado como un enorme acordeón. Y dentro, ¡qué carnicería! Debo ser insensible porque no me conmovió el dolor de aquellos infelices.
Tengo hambre. Insensible y se desmayó usted al desfilar ante el cuerpo yacente del príncipe Lurca.
Oh, no compare usted. ¿Cómo podía quedar nadie indiferente ante la grandeza y la muerte de aquel admirable príncipe que fue nuestro amigo? Y aquel nobilísimo perfil.
¿En esta casa no se desayuna?
Yo creo que la gente del pueblo, la gente baja, es menos sensible al dolor. ¿Usted ha visto un toro herido alguna vez? Impasible.
Bueno, voy a retocarme un poco. Estamos todas hechas unos adefesios. Pero esto es tan divertido.
¿Has dormido bien?
¿Por qué me miras así, hermana? Debo estar horrible.
Estás más interesante que nunca. El desaliño te va muy bien.
¿Por qué me miras así? Debo estar horrible.
Estás más interesante que nunca. ¿El desaliño te va muy bien?
Qué buen oído tienen.
Pasó muy mala noche. Al amanecer perdió el conocimiento. Luego se repuso algo.
¿Por qué no nos avisaron enseguida? Debemos subirlo a una habitación y acostarlo.
Por el momento es mejor no moverlo. Vamos a ver qué se puede hacer por él.
Manténganlo abrigado.
Sí, anoche durante la cena yo ya lo noté un poco extraño.
Es posible que no sea nada. Ya ha tenido varias de estas.
¿Cómo lo encuentra, doctor?
Dentro de unas horas completamente calvo.
Perdón, no entiendo.
Quiero decir que le quedan pocas horas de vida.
Es horrible porque usted nunca falla en sus predicciones. Tampoco yo me siento muy bien.
Bah, tontería.
Vicious class prejudices are fully on display here, revealing the egotism of the wealthy. The same woman who feels no pity for the poor she saw killed in a train accident admits that she wept when the prince died. Another woman supports this prejudice with the absurd claim that the poor feel very little pain, comparing them to bulls. The self-absorbed bourgeois guests are immediately preoccupied with their appearance upon waking, including the fastidious and neurotic Francis. His sister Anna, with whom he may be having an incestuous relationship, she tries to calm him by saying that the disheveled look suits you, but he is inconsolable. Now, that phrase, the disheveled look suits you, is immediately repeated by another guest, reminding us that these absurd repetitions, while reminiscent of what happens often in dreams, also reflect the redundant habits of this social class. It's not just a function of bourgeois conformity, however, these repetitions. We also all suffer from it, Benoit suggests, to one degree or another. And in revealing the mechanical nature of our everyday lives through such repetitions, Buñuel shows that our habits produce a kind of mental blankness that obscures our awareness of reality. Buñuel writes, quote, "Every morning we get up, brush our teeth with the same brush, sit at the same breakfast table, go to the same office and say hello to someone, but then they'll exclaim, 'What are we doing? We just said hello a minute ago.'" Thus, the sense of repetition, habit in our ordinary life, not just as a way of satirizing the bourgeois. Now, once in a while, a character will become aware of the strangeness of these repetitions, like the individual in the Buñuel quote. As, for example, when the doctor corrects himself when he tells Leonora that the dying Russell will soon be bald. The same remark, of course, he made earlier about Leonora herself. What Buñuel is revealing in human nature is absent-mindedness, to which we are all prone at times, though perhaps especially the bourgeoisie. But note that in Exterminating Angels, this absent-mindedness, this repetition, is clearly taken to comic extremes. When we see behavioral repetitions, they make us laugh, and they do so for a reason that the turn-of-the-century French philosopher Henri Bergson explained in his influential treatise on comedy. Bergson characterizes all repetition in life, in language or in behavior, as a form of absent-mindedness. It's funny, he says, because repetition contradicts the inherently fluid, changeable nature of life itself. Bergson says that comedy arises from what he calls la mécanique sous plaque vivante, that is, mechanism encrusted on life. He writes, quote, "Life presents itself to us as an evolution in time. It is the continuous evolution of being which never goes backward and never repeats itself. Life becomes comic, however, when it seems to forget itself through repetition, when it gets stuck instead of continuing to flow and change." Now, you'll note here that As a result, ludicrous events may be defined, he says, as, quote, an absent-mindedness in things or in individual characters. Well, characters who continue to act the same way in the face of new or different circumstances are always especially comic for Bergson, and Buñuel's film is full of them. It illustrates that concept. Some of the overnight guests, for example, are so absent-mindedly impervious, so mechanical, in the face of the weird circumstances that they are in, that one of them declares, quote, this is so much fun, and another absurdly claims that they've been detained by nothing more than a pleasurable spell of one another's company, completely blind to the inappropriate repetition of their behavior under the circumstances. Others, however, do sense something strange and know better, including the doctor. As young Beatrice had, the doctor and a few others now, upon waking the next morning, begin to ask why they haven't left and why they seem incapable of leaving. Have a look.
Me voy inmediatamente.
Y Alicia y yo la acompañamos. Pues no faltaba más. Si esto es francamente absurdo. Vamos.
¿Viene usted, Rita?
No, todavía no. ¿Qué va uno a hacer en la calle a estas horas?
Rita, por Dios. Usted también tiene niños como yo que van al colegio.
Mis hijos tienen preceptor en casa. El abate Samson. Un hombre muy culto, de trato exquisito. Yo creo, y perdonen si exagero, que tiene ribetes de santo. Aunque Cristiano opina que... ¿Verdad, Cristian?
Pero señora, por Dios, no nos hable ahora de abates. ¿Pero qué nos importa ahora su...? Vamos.
Perdonen ustedes.
Después de todo, con tomar un café nada se pierde. Estoy sin fumar por tener el estómago vacío.
También a mí me apetece. ¿Nos acompaña, Blanca?
Me parece excesivo. Casi histérico el ambiente de alarma que se está creando.
No es la primera vez que me dan las 8 de la mañana en algún party parecido a este.
Perdón, Lucía. No hay cucharillas para servirse el azúcar.
Perdónenme a mí, es que el pobre Julio no puede con todo. Julio, traiga las cucharillas.
Sí, señora. ¿Los señores no necesitan nada? ¿Una taza de café? ¿Algún fiambre?
Nada, Julio.
Vaya usted a donde le han ordenado. Creo que es más prudente esperar a que los señores terminen de desayunar para llevarme el servicio.
¿Qué le ocurre, Julio? ¿No me oyó? Le pedí que nos trajera las cucharillas.
Me permití sugerirle a los señores.
Basta. Le ruego que cumpla mis órdenes. ¿Qué le pasa? ¿No se encuentra bien? ¿Y a usted, Blanca, qué le ocurre? ¿Puedo ayudarle en algo?
The first expression of real anxiety about the situation comes when Blanca, who now for the third time declares, I'm leaving, looks out and finds that this is changing no one. Now, you remember she had said the same thing, I'm leaving, when she had originally finished at the piano. But the repetition of that phrase doesn't change her behavior or anyone else's. She says she needs to get back home to her family. And while the others prepare to depart as well, none of them can exit the room. Some, out of blind conformity, which masks a deeper cause, suggest that they are simply staying because everyone else is staying. For example, when Eduardo and the other male guests compare notes and ask why they didn't leave, each says to the other, I don't know, suggesting that they were simply acting in accordance with what everyone else was doing, even though this conformity violates normal etiquette because their squatting overnight in the salon is turning it into what one aptly describes as a gypsy campground. Other guests try to justify their mysterious paralysis, their inability to leave, by inventing excuses that mask a more mysterious inertia. As the conductor approaches the exit, for example, he says at the last moment, "You know what? I want some coffee." And Rita says that she's staying because she claims that she has nothing to do at home, notwithstanding her children there. Clearly, such individuals are deceiving themselves. But there are a few members of this cast who do recognize that they are being trapped by an agonizing failure of will, by an inability to act upon their individual desires freely. This is true of Blanca, perhaps above all, who is desperate to escape and more aware than nearly anyone that some kind of psychic impediment is preventing her and all of them from leaving. She urgently tries to get Rita to go with her, reminding her that in fact you too have children. She's trying to enlist another's support here in order to force herself to act on her desires freely. But failing in this, Blanca sits down and weeps in frustration and despair and confusion by the archway, that threshold of liberation, looking into another room that they can't enter. The butler, Julio, stops in this exact same place. After being summoned into the salon with breakfast trays, he stops at that invisible barrier because he's unable to obey Nobile's commands to go into the kitchen and then return with sugar spoons. Now, the request for special spoons, of course, under the circumstances, is absurd and illustrates the mechanism of ridiculous bourgeois manners. The conductor's wife says she's clearly unable to take breakfast without a special sugar spoon, even though there are several other kinds of spoons on the tray. Now, Julio is better educated than the other servants. He looks down on his peers and he aspires to the class that he serves. But now he's paralyzed with them, a victim, if you will, of the same strange disease. As a rainstorm outside darkens the sky, we return to the long shot of the living room, shot from the empty room that they cannot enter. Trapped in the salon, they're already running out of water and food after less than 24 hours. The mood of exhausted levity now gives way to paranoia and increasing hysteria. The overwrought and hypersensitive Francis now tells his sister, "We're doomed. Why did you bring me here?" Leonora shrieks in a fit of terror, associating the general paralysis she sees with her fear of impending death. Meanwhile, conspiracy theories begin to abound. Have a look.
Todo esto es formidable. Calma ante todo, señores. Peor que el pánico no hay nada. Una situación como esta no puede durar indefinidamente. No estamos encantados, amigos. Este no es el castillo de un brujo. Solo analizando fríamente lo que está ocurriendo aquí, podremos hacer frente a nuestra bulia. Yo propongo lo siguiente. Callémonos un instante. Hagamos un esfuerzo supremo. Un acto enérgico de la voluntad que encierre el firme propósito de salir de aquí. De lograr lo que todos...
Cállese usted, Nobile. Es lo mejor que puede hacer. Usted nos ha ido metiendo en esta trampa. Nos ha hecho víctimas de esta pesada broma o lo que sea.
Yo, amigo mío, por haberlos invitado a cenar, por haberles ofrecido mi casa.
Precisamente. Usted nos fue llamando uno a uno para que viniéramos a cenar después de la ópera. Una invitación amable, cordiales amigos. Me harán el honor, etcétera. Cada uno pudo haber ido a dormir a su casa o a un prostíbulo, mejor que aquí. Diga, ¿a qué obedeció aquella invitación tan extemporánea?
¿Extemporánea? ¿Por qué? Todos estaban encantados. Usted mismo expresó su satisfacción por lo cordial de la recepción.
Pues rectifico y declaro que aquí no hay más que un culpable de esta degradante situación. Y es usted.
¿Yo? Creo que ha perdido usted la cabeza, Raúl.
Edmundo tiene razón. Es usted un majadero.
Si no fuera usted una dama.
Mira el mayordomo, a él no le sabe mal el agua.
Me duele la cabeza.
No.
The conductor blames the servants for bringing on the strange confinement by leaving the house. The thuggish Raoul accuses the host here and later, Edmondo, of setting a trap for them all with his dinner invitation in a house where the servants have fled like, quote, rats from a sinking ship. Others, including Blanca, suspect that they haven't been rescued because of some calamity occurring in the outside world. As they urge each other on with such paranoid speculations, we get a hint of the primitive mob violence that lies ahead. Because here as elsewhere, both Dr. Conti and Edmonto try to fail to calm the group. The doctor encourages, quote, a dispassionate analysis of their situation, and the host, Edmondo, asks for a calming moment of silence so that they might summon up their will to leave. Both of these appeals fail. The scene devolves into violence as Letitia lives up to her nickname, the Valkyrie, by slapping Raoul for heaping scorn on Edmondo. Raoul, in turn, has to be pulled away to keep from striking a woman, something unthinkable under ordinary circumstances. Clearly, the crust of superficial matters is breaking down completely. As the scene ends, Buñuel's camera pans to a painted door that bears the image of Saint Michael, the archangel, defender of the faith and exterminator of Satan. But when the door opens, we see that behind it, as the conductor emerges, is a water closet. In short, the religious icons on the door conceal behind them a toilet. Well, bodily urges and bodily appetites increasingly hold sway. And Buñuel explores, I think, three drives in particular that are normally suppressed within the unconscious or concealed under conventions of social conduct. They are uninhibited sexual desire, violent aggression, and finally a longing for death, what Freud referred to as thanatos, the desire to return to a prior state of non-being. Now, Buñuel knew Freud's work well, and in Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he advanced the theory that eros, which is the urge to perpetuate life and pleasure, is in a constant conflict with a more powerful longing for death, a longing for extinction. Freud suggests that each creature wishes to die, but that we go on living because we want to die, as he puts it, in our own fashion. Whereas the dying Leonora fears the end, others see the exterminating angel of death as something that they unconsciously crave, that they want to surrender to, but always in their own way. Have a look at this clip.
Contento. No veré exterminio.
A mí tampoco me importaría morir. Pero no así. Rodeada de gente sin poder estar sola contigo.
Ese es mi gran martirio, no poder estar solos.
Y sin embargo, hay un medio de poder separarnos de los demás.
De veras no es posible. ¿Cómo?
Te lo diré cuando todos duerman. Si es que se deciden a dormir. Al levantar la tapa, he visto un gran precipicio. Y al fondo las aguas claras en torrente.
Sí, y antes de sentarme, un águila cruzó unos metros debajo de mí. A mí, el viento me lanzó un gran remolino de hojas secas sobre la cara. Tengo frío.
Russell, the oldest member of the group, welcomes death as he offers a prophecy here of extermination, which he says he will not have to witness. But Beatrice, the youngest guest, who is also drawn to death, and remember she had said that she wanted to leave, now says that she wouldn't mind dying. She is echoing Freud, however, when she says that she wants to die in her own way. She wants to die not out there where people can see them, but alone with her fiancé. Beatrice's death wish, however, is clearly in conflict with her drive toward erotic life. Indeed, she and Eduardo exchange an intimate kiss in this scene in public and prepare to have sex for the first time while the others are sleeping. Eros is holding off her desire for death, but only for a while, because as the weeks pass, the lovers' Eros gives way to the stronger force of Thanatos, and eventually they commit suicide together, slitting their wrists as they lie in the same closet where they have made love. Buñuel dramatizes the Eros versus Thanatos struggle that Freud describes in the human psyche, I think, in a brilliant juxtaposition. As Beatrice and Eduardo are consummating their love, as I described, the doctor is pronouncing the words consummatum est on the dead Russell. The doctor is quoting Christ's last words on the cross, meaning it is finished. But nothing, in fact, is finished here. We see Eros and we see death juxtaposed, but the doctor and Alvaro feel that for the sake of the group, they must hide the man's corpse in a closet adjoining the one where the lovers are lying. But of course, it doesn't stay put there, so it seems. Because although death and Eros now, closet by closet, exist side by side, as I've suggested, death doesn't remain concealed or suppressed. The corpse's hand falls out that night, terrifying the women who see it, and later triggering a hallucination. Now, some might argue that the paralysis of the entire group might be read as a kind of collective death wish. But this urge to extinction that I've described in a number of individuals, certainly like Russell and Beatrice, doesn't take hold of everyone. For some, the urge to survival and the desire for deliverance at any cost is paramount, and the attempt to achieve that deliverance leads them to strange forms of superstitious behavior. 3 of the women, for example, compare notes on the visions that they experienced when they opened the lid of the commode to relieve themselves in the privy. One of them saw a cliff down below, another saw a soaring eagle, and a third saw leaves blowing. Well, as they stand in front of the Catholic icon of St. Michael, Buñuel parodies religious visions in these toilet-inspired hallucinations. As the group descends into survivalist savagery, at least those who have not found the fashion in which they wish to die, as they descend into this savagery, defecation becomes a form of religious experience, so it seems. You go to the toilet and you'll find some sort of mystical vision. As the guests prepare to bed down for yet another night of entrapment, Buñuel reminds us that the uncanny events unfolding are similar to what we might experience in a dream. The camera pans across the crowded, messy room with recumbent bodies on every surface, and the state of the salon reveals the characters' collective descent into a kind of non-rational state of being. As one critic puts it, quote, "The salon has the slovenly disorderliness of a tired, capsizing mind, slipping through a twilight state into a dream." Now, when we cut to another outside shot of the mansion, we learn that 4 days have passed. Police have now gathered at the entrance gate, but inexplicably they cannot enter any more than the guests inside can leave. The strange force that prevents entry even causes military troops to turn back. Meanwhile, inside, as in certain kinds of disaster films that Buñuel is parodying, the basic need for water is immediate, and it leads to desperate action. After certain failed efforts to break into the water pipes, Raoul, using brute force, does so, gets to those pipes behind the wall, and in doing so, we find the last vestiges of civilized restraint collapsing in a mad scramble and fight to get to the water. Have a look.
¡Fuera! ¡Fuera! ¡La mujer primero! ¡Fuera! ¡Fuera! ¡La mujer primero! Señoras, amigos, fuera. Señoras, no han oído. Pónganse en fila. Pónganse en fila. Primero un solo paso cada uno, después a la segunda vuelta beban cuanto quieran. La falta de contención puede ser peligrosa, sobre todo para los enfermos.
Con moderación, señor.
No ha oído que las mujeres primero ocupen su lugar.
Well, the prisoners now have water, but they still don't have food. And in a scene of comic absurdity that I think is one of the richest in the film, we see the hungry butler Julio eating paper. He says he's ingesting it to deceive his stomach into thinking that it's actually nutritious food. He tells Beatrice that he learned this trick as a boy in a Jesuit school as a way to combat boredom, hinting thereby that everything else that the Jesuits taught him was somehow a kind of boring experience, but also, like the tricking of his stomach, everything else they taught him was also a kind of fantasy. Now remember that Buñuel went to a Jesuit school himself, and in this scene with the paper eating, he's parodying the Eucharist, because after all, the saucer holding the paper balls that Julio is ingesting resembles the paten from which a priest dispenses Holy Communion. For Buñuel, the idea of the Eucharist as Christ's body is absolute make-believe, no more nourishing physically or spiritually than the bits of paper that the butler is eating. It is a measure of Beatrice's relative vitality and clarity of vision that she is reluctant to engage in this kind of self-delusion when invited to join him in this paper eating. As I've noted, Beatrice is the youngest and the most vital member of the group, but she is paradoxically also the one that harbors perhaps the most profound death wish. Perhaps the intensity then of these competing drives of Eros and Thanatos within her gives her a fuller grasp of reality than any of the other characters, that she is somehow more in touch with the deepest strata of her being. In her clear-eyed vitality and in her recognition and attraction to death, she is the opposite of two other characters, who I've mentioned already, Francis and Leonora. The former, Francis, is sick in mind, the latter, Leonora, sick in body. And the fear of death that drives both of them leads them to delusions and hysteria. The hypersensitive Francis tells his sister, for example, that he can't bear to see the ragged, traumatized-looking Anna Mayer combing just one side of her hair in a mirror. I hate her, he tells his sister, who's also named Anna. Note that Buñuel here plays on doubling. As one Anna, his sister, confronts the other Anna, who's been combing her hair, and admonishes her for her strange grooming quirks, showing her the right way to do it, while her brother Francis breaks the comb violently. Meanwhile, Blanca, the pianist, sits distracted and alone, as she often does, pulling out her hair by the roots. Now, about this same time, Rita and Christian discuss how much they miss their children, but this quickly escalates into a fight when the husband accuses his wife of betraying him with the dean who is in charge of the children's care. A moment later, Christian and Raoul nearly come to blows when Christian accuses Raoul of eavesdropping on his conversation. Everyone in the salon seems to be watching everyone else with suspicion and loathing. It is a version of Sartre's famous claim that hell is other people. In the most shocking and gratuitous act of aggression, however, Raoul, who knows that Christian is suffering painfully without his ulcer pills, finds that lost pill box by chance in the trash. But then, in a moment of unbridled sadistic aggression, he thinks and tosses the pill box across the threshold into the other room, where he knows Christian can't reach it. Have a look.
Tengo frío. Tengo frío. Tengo frío.
Just before this disturbing scene, Edmondo has again asked the guest for calm, reminding the group that we're all in the same boat. But the primary menace in this instance isn't something outside the group, as it would be, say, in a conventional disaster film. Rather, the menace is the escalating irrational violence that is erupting within the group. Now, in showing this, Buñuel raises a philosophical question. Is the savage self-interest on display the true state of human nature, the true state beneath all the veil of manners? Or has the group's mystifying situation perverted their natures into forms of brutality that we see? Well, I'm not sure there's a conclusive answer, but I think Buñuel tilts toward a dark view of egocentric aggression as the truest and most authentic state of human nature, frightening as that sounds. The aggression breaks out when customs and inhibitions under the circumstances collapse. Now, in this atmosphere, of course, the stench from the privy is becoming unbearable, as are the unwashed bodies of the guests, which repel one another. The fastidious Francis, for example, tells Blanca, "You smell like a hyena." Yet in a moment of surreal incongruity, we see Lucia's lover Gomez shaving his legs amid the squalor. Physical violence and verbal cruelty, however, aren't the only manifestation of this collective plunge into irrational primitivism. Some in the group also turn superstitiously to various religious appeals. Alvaro suggests organizing, for example, a rosary to pray for deliverance because, quote, "only a miracle now will save us." His wife vows to offer a mass of thanksgiving if God will only deliver them. Meanwhile, led on by Ana, Sylvia, and Blanca, join hands in a ritual of the Jewish Kabbalah, which is strangely blended with voodoo incantations and chicken feathers. Leonora asks the doctor if he'll accompany her when they get out to Lourdes, provided they escape. Christian tries to break the spell of paralysis by bellowing Masonic calls for help, and the conductor seeks deliverance by spelling out the Masonic cult's mystical forbidden word. Well, for Buñuel, all of these gestures are rooted in superstition, and all of them fail. Buñuel, throughout the film, I think, plays on Marx's famous claim that religion, in all its forms, is the opium of the people. And you'll note that when Edmondo brings out a secret cache of morphine-infused barbiturates that he keeps for his recreational use, this notion of a kind of opium in order to deaden collective anxiety becomes even clearer. Now, Edmondo does this because he says, quote, "suffering is horrible to me." And he wants, especially as host, to ease Leonora's pain, the pain of the dying woman, which is both physical and psychic. Instead, however, these drugs are stolen by the perpetual needy and greedy, narcissistic Francis. His egotism and cruelty are exceeded really only by the thuggish Raoul's. Surrounded by misery, Alvaro's wife implores him to, quote, "think of a way to get me out of this nightmare." Now, the surreal situation seals these characters in a nightmare, in a terrible dreamlike state that we share with them. But Buñuel also gives us, within this collective nightmare atmosphere, individual hallucinations, waking dreams, and hypnagogic visions within the generalized surreal nightmare of the film. Have a look at Anna's hysterical waking dream in particular. Days earlier, the superstitious Anna, the keeper of the chicken's feet, awoke to see the dead hand of Russell fall out of the closet. Just before going to sleep, she hears the doctor's conversation with the dying Leonora. She's terrified that death will claim her too, is Anna. And so, these two memories, on the one hand of the hand out of the closet and on the other of a woman talking about death, these two memories produce for her a hallucination in which the dead man's hand comes to life and tries to take her life, tries to suffocate her. Now remember that the fatal evening began with a production of Lucia de Lammermoor, a character who in the opera hallucinates in a famous mad scene. All right? Later, Buñuel gives us a dream montage in which he meets the surrealist challenge of visually representing the life of the unconscious in a kind of cinematographic madness. As the camera, as you'll see, pans over the sleepers, Buñuel pauses to enter the dreams or half-waking dreams of Raoul and Rita and Edmondo, and that these states of unconsciousness reflect for each individual their deepest blocked desires, but also their deepest fears. Have a look.
Cierren pronto las ventanas. ¡Sálvese quien pueda!
En un momento habrá millones en el salón.
Es muy tarde ya, hijito. Ven a acostarte.
No tengo sueño.
¡Qué muchedumbre!
Murió en pecado mortal.
Libérame, Domine, de morte eterna, quando cieli modem nisum eterna.
¡Hijo mío de mi alma! ¡Que no te volveré a ver más!
Mira allí. No, en la cumbre. ¿Lo ves?
El Papa.
Sí, él es. Qué lleno de majestad, qué solemne. Se diría un guerrero.
Espera, te pondré bien la almohada. Buenas noches, hijito.
Buenas noches, mamá.
In this sequence, we first hear the sounds of these dreams. Rita hears the voice of her son, with whom she longs to be reunited, but whom she fears she'll never see. Raoul's dream has the sound of breaking glass, linked to his penchant for violence. The devout Edmondo, who fears dying in a state of mortal sin, hears celestial church music as he longs for God's deliverance. All of these dream wishes reflect Freud's view of dreams as attempted wish fulfillments. Using superimpositions and a blurred lens, Buñuel then provides dream images to accompany some of these sounds. Edmondo sees a pristine mountain peak in the distance that he associates with moral purification before death, and also perhaps with liberation from captivity through prayer to God and his church. Raoul's dreams are characteristically violent, like the sounds. A saw cutting a violin in half seems to reflect his sadistic desires, but at the same time, these desires frighten Raoul. He's afraid of what they reveal about his own brutal instincts and capacities. Other characters simply act out their submerged desires in the absence of customary restrictions, not in the form of dreams, but in the world. The hoary old conductor, for example, gropes Rita as she is sleeping. When she screams out, her husband Christian, who has had doubts about her fidelity, wrongly accuses Colonel Gomez. Now, we know that Gomez has been carrying on his own illicit affair with Lucia, and the two men in this argument promptly agree to a duel. This is, of course, a preposterous vestige of cultural tradition that has no place within the anarchy and savagery of the present, but is characteristically formal in the kind of mechanized way bourgeois life is. Now, even the normally composed Alvaro snaps at this point, pushing Alicia to the floor when she pleads for his help, and then apologizing as if he has just awoken from a dream. Quote, "I didn't know how I could have done that." Characters are becoming aware of instincts in themselves, aggressive and even bestial impulses that they didn't know they possessed. Well, the sexual groping by the conductor prompts Eduardo to suggest that all the men and women should sleep separately, because the danger rises that men, under these circumstances, being unable to control their erotic urges. And we know, of course, that the conductor, despite his age, seems to be an absolute erotic virago, according to his wife. Well, for the engaged lovers, acting out submerged desires can mean only one thing. After they have consummated their love sexually, it means joining together in a suicide pact, because they have now found the fashion, to use Freud's words, in which they wish to die. The fashion is to die embracing one another as they embrace death itself. Have a look at their suicide pact.
¿Qué día es hoy?
¿Cómo?
¿Cuánto tiempo llevamos aquí? Más de un mes, ¿verdad?
No tanto. No hubiéramos podido resistir sin comer.
Me parece que siempre hemos estado aquí.
Igual me pasa a mí.
Y aquí seguiremos siempre. A menos que huyamos juntos. Que nos perdamos en las sombras. No me responde.
Donde tú vayas iré yo, Eduardo.
For these lovers, time has lost its meaning. Doesn't even seem to be measurable. They can't say how long they have been in captivity at the Noblesse, nor can they foresee a future. And this obliteration of meaningful or comprehensible time and space makes death irresistible for them. And they fulfill their vow to escape life together. Quote, "Where you go, I go, and where they go is into the shadows." Now, here Buñuel poses, I think, a difficult and perhaps unanswerable question. Is the suicide that these lovers soon enact an expression of existential freedom, perhaps the only freedom possible under the circumstances, or is it merely the fulfillment of their elemental drive to death, as Freud claims all of us are driven, and all of us would seize upon if we found the way in which, or the right fashion in which, to extinguish ourselves? Well, again, I don't know that there is a single answer to it. At this point of conflict, however, something unexpected happens that momentarily unites everyone. The sheep that Lucia has been keeping for whatever reason, and that we saw earlier in the kitchen, now emerge, and Buñuel's camera pans to show the group watching them in a moment of wide-eyed wonder. Now, this shot of the group comes, again, as a long shot of the salon with the guests in it from the other side. And as we watch the sheep move across to the threshold and enter the salon, we suddenly see this group in a long shot descend upon them as one. The starving castaways descend upon them en masse, much as they had descended upon the water pipe. Have a look. Now, I think the playful symbolism here points in a decidedly ironic direction. As I've noted, Buñuel has used the sheep to represent the entire bourgeois class, blindly conforming and easily led. But now, the guests, the bourgeois guests, attack the sheep. We later see them roasting one of them over an open fire. They're giving way to their savage survival instincts. In short, they seem then to be preying upon the image of themselves, and appropriately so, because we also see these bourgeois attacking one another, preying upon themselves in that sense. Now, in this respect, I think, sheep are associated with ritual sacrifice, clearly, but the killing of a sheep, even if it is for food, foreshadows the plan to sacrifice Edmondo shortly hereafter as a scapegoat. But we see another animal in this scene as well. Not the actual physical bear, but the shadow of the bear moving up the stairs, now unchained. What on earth are we to make of this? Presumably the bear is in pursuit of the sheep, but this is the last we see of it. Well, you remember when the bear first appeared in the kitchen, it was already wildly ambiguous. It could symbolize, I suggested, the release of the guest's animal rapacity to come, because we see the bear roaming the house now at the same time that a fight is breaking out when one guest tries to push another in the bear's direction. In short, one could argue that the bear from the very beginning is the embodiment of a kind of primal animal energy, a kind of anarchic instinct in human nature that emerges. But on the other hand, I noted that we might view this animal as embodying a kind of natural vitality that is missing in most of the surviving characters, except after the death of the lovers, perhaps Letitia. Now, Buñuel once complained, and I think you'll find this amusing, that, quote, people attribute symbols to me arbitrarily, and the bear may be a classic example of that kind of interpretive practice. Buñuel noted that one Mexican critic interpreted the bear as a symbol of the Soviet Union, and that by going upstairs, this critic argued, the bear represents the threat of communism holding the privileged class under its siege. Well, Buñuel himself claimed that the bear was in the film simply because Lucia intended to present it as a surprise to her guest. He recalled that when they let the bear loose in the scene you just saw, during the filming, everyone on the set was terrified and ran out. But can we really believe that the creature has no figurative meaning given the film's thematic ambitions and its visual complexity? I don't think so. So I think it's helpful, then, to consider the bear as a deliberately open-ended and maddeningly ambiguous symbol within the film's semiology. And to that extent, I think it might be helpful to consider it through the lens of Peter Wallen's influential book, Signs and Meaning in Cinema, that I assigned in relationship to Exterminating Angel. Wallen notes that cinema expresses its complexity through images that function as a language of signs. And drawing on the philosophy of Charles Peirce, Wallen classifies these signs in cinema under three headings that he calls icon, index, and symbol. An icon, he says, is a sign in which the relationship between the signifier, that is the image, and what is signified, the meaning of that image, lies in a very close resemblance. A portrait of a man, for example, signifies that individual because the image resembles the individual, and thus that image functions as an icon. In an index, however, the bond between the representation of the sign and its meaning is less literal and more metonymic. In Hitchcock's Rear Window, for example, we see a thermometer that reads 90 degrees. The sign indicates that it's hot outside, that it's summer, because we associate the thermometer and summer functionally. A thermometer measures heat. But note, a sign that operates in the third way as a symbol requires neither resemblance to its object, like an icon, nor association with the icon, like a indice. Now, It's true that some symbols, for example, like a cross or the scales of justice or a heart, are so well established in their meanings that those meanings seem immutable. But Wallen says that most symbolic images in film are essentially arbitrary, that there is no pre-established connection between the image and its meaning, either through resemblance or some sort of functional association or cultural tradition. Now, Wallen claims that films use all three of these classes of signs, and that oftentimes they can overlap. And I think we see an example of that overlap in the image of St. Michael on the privy door that Buñuel shows us so frequently. It seems to, in some way, constitute all three kinds of signs that Wallen describes simultaneously. It's an icon in that it resembles the archangel that it represents. Okay, it is an icon, literally and figuratively, of the archangel Michael. But it is also an index for Catholicism, the faith that produced the image and within which the archangel functions as a heroic figure. And at the same time, this image of Michael is also a rich and elusive symbol because Buñuel invests St. Michael with diverse concepts that have no obvious connection to the image itself, including, as I noted, the Spanish political organization that bears the name Exterminating Angel. Okay? That is one of potentially several symbolic associations built around it that have no intrinsic meaning when we look at the image itself. Now, Wallen complains that film critics too often regard the use of signs as symbols as a measure of aesthetic value, and that they tend to overinterpret these symbolic images and exaggerate the importance of symbols and even distort them in an attempt to validate cinema as an elevated art form. Critics, he charges, have embraced the symbolic nature of images, often to the exclusion of powerful icons and indices. In short, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. And often as well, when we assign, rightly or wrongly, symbolic meanings to certain images, we reduce them, when in fact Wallen suggests they perhaps are meant to remain, quote, uncoded, imprecise, and nebulous. And I think that is precisely what Buñuel wants with this bear, for us to recognize that it must be a kind of free-floating symbol that is uncoded, imprecise, and nebulous. Now, where does Wallen's theory leave us overall in Buñuel's film? Is the bear then just Lucia's dinner surprise, or is it a rather mystifying symbol that defies reductive interpretation? Why not both? But I'll let you be the judge. At the end of the last clip, we see a fine example of graphic matching. Although Buñuel disdained Hollywood, he uses this studio editing technique when he cuts from a shot of the chandelier hanging in the ceiling in the next moment to a shot of a similar shaped collection of balloons floating outside. Yet ironically, this similarity calls attention to the difference between the two worlds. In the sunshine outside, a priest has just brought Christians' children, hoping that they'll be allowed to enter and lure the parents out to join them, but to no avail. Now, children for Buñuel are almost always more vital and sensitive than adults. So the child holding a balloon instinctively runs away as he approaches the door of the house, sensing that there is something wrong there. Now, soon, the escaped servants, who had a similar sense, gather outside the mansion. One of them actually protects the bear from being shot, because just as the servants have escaped the chains of their servitude, so too the bear has escaped his chains. Yet another symbolic link or potential meaning of the bear. Inside the house, the guests are roasting the lamb that they have killed in their determination to survive. As this is going on, blood is flowing from the dead lover's closet out below the door, where they have slit their wrists. Amid the rotting lambskins in this fetid room, a plot is emerging to kill Edmondo as a kind of sacrificial lamb himself. And indeed, that plot is gaining necessary force. Reverting to primitive religious practice, a practice that cuts across multiple religions, the group, led by Raoul, wants to enact a scapegoat ritual. They project blame on Edmondo for their misery, presumably whatever within them might have contributed to it, they project onto him, hoping that his death will carry away whatever evil force within themselves or around them is causing the collective suffering. When Anna's incantations fail, she too says, "I need the blood of an innocent." Almost everyone is in accord here. And so the mob's need for some purgative bloodshed is turned on the host with calls of "kill him, kill him." Have a look.
Voz alta. Que todos sepamos lo que traman.
Lo que queremos es terminar con él.
Terminar con él. Pero se han vuelto locos. Esto es insensato, completamente irracional.
No queremos razones. Queremos salir de aquí.
Si buscan pelea, la van a encontrar.
Álvaro, apártese. Nada queremos con usted ni con el doctor.
La necesidad excusa nuestra acción.
¡Mátenlo!
¡Más vale tarde que
déjenos pasar.
Oigan antes, locos.
Maten al doctor también. Por algo se opone.
Piensen antes en las terribles consecuencias de lo que van a hacer. Este vil atentado no será el único. Supone la desaparición de la dignidad humana. El convertirse en bestias.
Apártese, doctor. O no respondo de lo que pueda sucederle.
¡Basta de discursos! ¡A él! ¡Basta, Raúl, por favor! ¡No complique más las cosas! ¡Le dije que no se metiera en lo que no le importa, doctor! No hagamos las cosas.
Déjalo.
¡Bien, jóvenes!
Señores, no es necesaria la violencia. Es inútil luchar por algo que es tan fácil conseguir. Gracias, Leticia.
Now, I think there are three notable things here that I want to call your attention to. First, the group alliance of men and women who support the murder is forged through a combination of self-interest and conformity, which are the very same traits that, for Buñuel, define the bourgeoisie in its more civilized incarnation. So in this sense, they haven't really changed, even though in many ways it appears through the emergence of their primitive instincts, they have. Note that the doctor, again, calls for dignity and restraint, but that call only inflames the group so that they decide to kill him too, precipitating a chaotic fight. The second thing that's notable here is the willingness of the victim. Emerging from behind a curtain, Edmondo gets a pistol out of a cabinet and seems all too ready to offer himself to be shot in a gesture of self-sacrifice. It's easily done, he says. This urge to extinction on his part traces back to an earlier remark Edmondo made, that his responsibility as host for the general misery makes the prospect of death appealing. Now, in Freudian terms, sacrifice at the hands of others, then, would seem to be the specific fashion in which Edmondo Nobile longs to fulfill his desire for death. But at this moment, suddenly, through Letitia's intervention, Edmondo and all the others are saved. The prisoners are freed. Before we consider how this happens, however, I want to note a third intriguing suggestion in the scene that you've just seen. Buñuel implies that Letitia and Edmondo may well have become lovers. There are hints that the Valkyrie has offered up her virginity to Edmondo as he is about to offer up his life to those who would sacrifice him. Remember that she is here, his handmaiden, standing beside him as he comes out from behind the curtain. And indeed, she has always, as we know, been Edmondo's defender. So we have to wonder then what the two were doing behind that curtain from which they merged in such solidarity. But at this intriguing moment, suddenly inspiration strikes and the spell of paralysis is broken. Letitia suddenly notes that after all of the changes in the positions of the people and the furniture in this room, that by what may be nothing more than random accident, they are now, at this instant, exactly in the same places they were when Blanca was playing the piano for them weeks before. By going back to that moment in which the paralysis seemed to set in and reenacting that moment, both in terms of where they were and what they said to her, suddenly through that repetition, time and space become unstuck, and they can leave as they had intended to leave that very first night. Have a look.
Aplaudían. Blanca, usted bajaba del estrado. Algunos amigos se acercaban. ¿Quién empezaba a hablar? Hagan un esfuerzo de memoria. Recuérdenlo.
Interpretación deliciosa.
Contéstele, Blanca. ¿Qué le hubiera usted contestado?
Sí. Sí.
Qué lástima no disponer, no haber tenido un clavicémbalo. La audición hubiera sido una audición perfecta. Ahora algo de Escarlata y Blanca. Se lo suplico.
Es demasiado tarde para seguir tocando, ¿verdad, Blanca? Son las 3 de la madrugada.
Les ruego que me disculpen. Es tarde. Estoy fatigada.
Efectivamente, todos estamos fatigados. Es muy tarde y deseamos retirarnos. Díganme todo, venga. Vamos, díganme.
Sí, salimos antes. Sí. Por aquí, señores. Por aquí. Por aquí. Vamos.
Now, after so much mindless repetition in their behavior, and Buñuel's doubling of certain gestures and words throughout, after all of that, it is surely ironic that now a knowing and deliberate act of repetition frees these individuals. It makes no rational sense that a seemingly random repositioning of bodies should suddenly be the key to this discovery and to their liberation. And Letitia doesn't attempt to explain it. She simply notes it. But I think it's significant that this woman who broke a window earlier by throwing a wine glass through the pane now leads them through the invisible glass that has trapped them for so long. Is this some inexplicable magic, or is it nothing more than the power of suggestion that frees the group now that it's been suggested that they can be freed? Just as one might note the the power of suggestion may have trapped them to begin with. It is difficult to say. It is profoundly ambiguous, I think. But given Buñuel's disdain for magic, for the supernatural, in any respect, I think that the implication may be that somehow now this suggestion that they can be free by reenacting what once held them back is really little more than a function of the power of suggestion. And so Edmondo now leads the guests out of the house, much as he had herded them into the house. The film's conclusion takes us back to the cathedral and the liturgical music we saw at the beginning. A Thanksgiving Mass is underway. Inside, the camera pans across the same faces that we've seen in the house, but they're now freed. But are they really free? Or have they, in going to church, simply changed one prison for another? They seem entrapped here not only by their reliance on religion, but literally trapped, literally imprisoned once again when the Mass ends. Neither the priests nor those who had been attending the Mass, as they gather at the door, seem capable of walking out. As one says, something's wrong. We've heard this before. Another repetition, perhaps. The scene makes explicit Buñuel's view of religion as one of the imprisoning codes of bourgeois life that prevents both personal and social change. The characters, in short, seem to have learned nothing from their captivity. But as a coda, we get a famously ambiguous yet provocative final scene, which begins with the church's tolling bells. Have a look. Riots going on in the streets and a violent military response. This was shot, I believe, in the main square, the Plaza Mayor in Mexico City. But we don't know what is happening. Sheep run into the church now, much as the conforming flock of characters had gone in earlier. But how are these contrasting images of warfare in the streets and sheep going into the church related? Well, I think Buñuel's juxtaposition implies that we consider a possible cause and effect here. And here is one possibility that I will offer to you. The blind adherence to oppressive class behavior, socially and religiously, Buñuel suggests, may lead one day to rebellions in the streets on the part of the oppressed, the serving class, the proletariat, and that would constitute something like a real liberation, not the false liberation, if you will, of the guests from the Noble house. The tolling bells then may be announcing that this revolutionary time is soon at hand.